Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 14th of March 2024. This is a geopolitical news segment video. We're going to start with France, and then I'm going to give you a bit of francophilia here, where I'm just going to get all a bit... les Français sont... Oh, très bien. Oh, c'est merveilleux. Oh, bof. Where I start just giving a bit of French love. So, we're going to start with Marine Le Pen. And some people have been saying, whoa, Marine Le Pen, who, just to give you the context, if you don't know who Marine Le Pen is, she is the French far-right populist party leader of the party that's gone from being called Front National, or the National Front, to being France Rally, basically, in French. And they've rebranded themselves and actually done a really good job of attracting lots of support. So they are actually much more popular at the moment than Macron's own centrist party, I believe, in polling. And we've got European elections coming up in France that you could see her party do very well, which will be a lot of Euroscepticism, and it will sow further division inside the EU with EU unity. So traditionally, her party has had, well, not traditionally, but her party has had connections to the Russians. The Russians funded them back in, I think, 2017 when they were struggling to get funding. So they went to Russian Bank, Russia. Basically, this is something like her party is the gift that Putin absolutely wants and loves. The division that you can sow in European unity, that Euroscepticism that comes with people like UKIP in the UK, there and soon to be the Reform Party, or what Reform Party is its present iteration, really. That's exactly what Putin wants is Euroscepticism, because European unity in the EU is the biggest foe of Putin and the Kremlin going forward, and has been for some years. I know lots of people think the US, but geographically speaking, the EU is far more of a threat to Russia and to, well, not to Russia, but to Putin and his power. And so any parties that cause division in the EU are parties that Putin and his disinformation project will support. I can name all the other parties as well. I wrote a big article on this recently about how he's stoking particularly the far right in Europe at the moment. So it was interesting that Marine Le Pen then came out recently, given her connections to Russia, and she has many, it came out recently and was quite strong against Putin. And so lots of people, like, as you can see here, Samia Romani here saying, Marine Le Pen strongly condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine in a sharp rhetorical turn. But don't be so sucked in by this. Fair play to Macron, says Stuart MacDonald MP. He showed up to the odious far-right Le Pen and far-left Mélenchon for what they really are. So actually, the far-right and the far-left in France have come out, and although Marine Le Pen was rhetorically quite on point there with what she said, she actually... her party actually abstained from voting for the security agreement with Ukraine, and the far left under Mélenchon actually voted against it. So, there's a lot to be said for the centrist parties in France at the moment, and for what Macron is doing. So Nexta says the odious far-right politician from France, who is called Putin's friend, unexpectedly supported Ukraine. French right-wing politician Marine Le Pen has changed her rhetoric and condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Quote, by invading Ukraine on February 24, 2022, Russia triggered a war on the EU's doorstep and a geopolitical crisis which is undoubtedly the most dramatic in the last 20 years. To the attacked Ukrainian nation, we owe our respect and support. Okay, so that's pretty good rhetoric. It's not going all in. There's not giving massive amounts of blame to Russia, but that is still really good to see Marine Le Pen do that. As Thierry Schmidlin, who's one of my viewers here, and a thank you to him and his support and members, she has understood that a majority of French and also from her electorate are pro-Ukraine. So a little communication to attract the hesitant. But behind that, the alignment to Putin stays wide open in the RM party, in France Rally Party, or the National Rally Party, sorry. So yeah, there is some good stuff to come from her, but also let's be a little bit careful. Now, French aid to Ukraine here translates what I showed you the other day. This guy, the new French Prime Minister, not the president, being really forceful in his rhetoric, and ending it with a bit of Slava Ukraine, giving exactly the right kind of temperament and rhetorical support to Ukraine in French Parliament, in the Senate.
Sont les vôtres, qui ont été les vôtres. Madame Le Pen, vous défendiez
Oh
une
no, no,
alliance militaire avec la...
sorry. This we'll come to that. This wasn't what he said the other day. This was what he said a couple of weeks ago, where he said to Marine Le Pen, "But I tell you, Mrs. Le Pen, when we read the investigations such as those carried out by the Washington Post, this is investigations into the funding of her party by Russia. We have to wonder if Vladimir Putin's troops are not already in our country. I'm talking about you and your troops, Mrs. Le Pen." And it was like, oh, this was like literally a drop mic moment. I think he dropped the mic.
Mais je vais vous le dire, Madame Le Pen. Quand on lit les enquêtes qui sont réalisées, encore celle du Washington Post le 30 décembre dernier, il y a lieu de se demander si les troupes de Vladimir Poutine ne sont pas déjà dans notre pays. Je parle de vous et de vos troupes, Madame Le Pen.
So it's not there, he dropped the mic. But anyway, that was really good. Anyway, going back to what Marine Le Pen has just said, Le Monde reports here French lawmakers approved Macron's Ukraine strategy. The Assemblée Nationale voted in favour of the government's Ukraine strategy, including a bilateral security agreement between France and Ukraine. France's Assemblée Nationale on Tuesday, March the 12th, Assemblée Nationale, get it right, on March the 12th, approved the government's Ukraine strategy, including a bilateral security agreement signed by Presidents Macron and Zelensky last month. The Senate was set to hold similar debates on Wednesday. Quote, "Ukraine is watching us, waiting for the confirmation and signal of our unity behind them," French Prime Minister Gabriel Attal, a guy you just heard from, told the chamber ahead of the vote. He added that, quote, "We are at a tipping point in the conflict, and that a Russian victory had, quote, real tangible dangers for everyday life for the French people." With the symbolic vote, Macron forced political parties to take a public stance. So this is the cleverness of Macron here. It's like, right, you've got to come out and say, so we can all know where you stand. And of course, Le Pen there gives the right rhetoric, but her party abstains, and the far left votes against it. So now everyone knows where you stand. The far right, Rassemblement National, RN, which poll says ahead of Macron's coalition by a wide margin in the June European elections, abstained, while the radical left La France Insoumise party voted against. Targeting the RN, Attal said ahead of the vote that, quote, "To abstain is to flee before your responsibility to history, and to betray what is dearest to us." He signed off with his opening speech with the Ukrainian battle cry Slava Ukraini, and I think that's where he dropped the mic. Speaking for the RN, party figure Marine Le Pen attacked Macron's warlike announcements in reference to his not ruling out the sending of Western troops to Ukraine. She also condemned European sanctions on Russian exports. So you might see these little bit where on Twitter people are saying, okay, and I do this just as much as anyone, like, oh, this is really good, she said this, fantastic. But the reality is, there's a lot more to it than originally evident. Right, sorry about doorbells and what have you. Returning to Le Monde newspaper here. Where do we get to? In references not ruling out the sending of Western troops to Ukraine, she also condemned European sanctions on Russian exports. So again, the devil's in the detail. Yeah, she's saying some good things here, but she's also calling out sanctions, some of which have considerably weakened our economies. Well, you wonder whether there's lobbying pressure on her and her party from Russia, from entities who want those components or products to be exported and not sanctioned. And she rejected the possibility of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO and the EU. So, you can say some nice bits about Ukraine here, but if you're then saying, well, you shouldn't be joining NATO and the EU, right? We should release some of the sanctions, which is what everyone agrees need to be tightened, and then is ruling out French troops being used. Okay, that's more of an area where you could argue. I just think she's still problematic, hugely problematic. The vote was designed so that either we're in favour of Macron or we're accused of being pro-Putin. Le Pen charge. Possibly, yeah. You got to pick your side, mate. Don't be on the wrong side of history, and try not to be on the wrong side of morality while you're at it. Accusing the government of hijacking, exploiting and instrumentalising a major international crisis for a short-term electoral agenda. I don't even care if Macron is doing that, if this is all part of his own personal political agenda, because it aligns perfectly with what is good and right and proper for the world. So, go for it, mate. LFI said it would vote against war and the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO and the European Union in the future. So that's the far left. Macron is set to speak about the war in a primetime TV broadcast on Thursday evening. That is good, right? So Macron has been, I think, well briefed on what's going on. We talked about this previously, about how there's been this point where he's gone, right, okay, I get what's happening now, and that's pretty scary, and I'm now going to go and communicate that to my international colleagues in European countries, and we need to do something about this, because I've just been scared by what I've been briefed with. But the next stage is communicating that to your population. So I think there's a lot of people in various countries, like the UK. Do we hear about this enough on our TV stations? France here, the country in question, the US. So Professor Gerdes on his video last night or yesterday was talking about how he was watching Fox News. But there was nothing on Ukraine when Ukraine had just been hammering the Russian oil refineries, affecting arguably 12% of their refined oil output. Why is that not there? Why is that not being talked about at all? Where is Ukraine in the news, and why are we not hearing about it when you and I think it is super important still, right? So that Macron is going and giving an address to his nation, seemingly about Ukraine. That is massive. I think Rishi Sunak should do that. It's so divisive in the US. The problem is it would seem partisan if Biden came out and did a whole big thing about Ukraine, because everyone would associate what he says with Democrats. Whereas in the UK, if Rishi Sunak came out and said that, we wouldn't necessarily think that. There's a real change in the US where this thing has become a partisan issue. And I think that's such a challenge going forward, because it stops the right thing from happening. Anyway, here is your Gabriel Attal.
À la tribune de l'Assemblée nationale de la France. Je le dis du plus profond de mes tripes qui se nouent autour de l'intérêt des Français. Slava Ukraini.
No, he didn't there. Where he's dropped the mic. What's that previous one? I'm sure there's a bit where he's dropped the mic in one of his speeches. Dang. Anyway, he says, I say this here as the Prime Minister of France on behalf of the French government from the rostrum of the French National Assembly. I say this from the depths of the soul that hurts the French. Glory to Ukraine. Brilliant. Like, this guy's on fire. He's only a young guy. He's new to his role, but I think he's taken it on particularly well. He's doing a good job. Right. Okay, let's now listen to the otherwise, right-wing, anti-EU, essentially, if you go back to Brexit time, Daily Telegraph podcast, or the Daily Telegraph is a podcast, they're warming to Macron and have been in the same way that I have over the last few weeks, making similar sort of pronouncements. Well, here's their analysis, or Francis Durney, who I've called out for being anti-EU before. In fact, I wrote an article on the back of something he said right at the beginning of the war. And I had I did speak to him about this via Twitter.
Francis, with all the activity and noise coming out from France and Emmanuel Macron, are you in risk of maybe potentially saying something nice about the French?
God forbid. But although my name is Francis, after all, so it's maybe was there beneath the surface all along. It is extraordinary, isn't it, how things have changed from where we were at the beginning of the war. There were very early condemnations of the French position. I remember people were saying, why on earth is Macron speaking to Putin for so long? Subsequent revelations have said that Zelensky was pushing for Macron to continue a dialogue with Putin, although Then later he said, please stop talking to Putin, it's no longer helpful, and Macron did continue. So there's been a lot of criticisms. I think bigger criticisms as well with regard to hesitancy on weapons deliveries in the first year of the war, certain unhelpful remarks that Macron made publicly. Then, of course, the relationship with China at a time when China were also seen as playing a very unhelpful role in the conflict. So it is interesting to see Macron's position evolve. I think that is partly due to domestic challenges. I think we need to be frank about that. I think also when you have a president...
So similar sort of thing that Boris Johnson did at the beginning of the war, where he was suffering so much domestically that actually he was getting a lot of personal gain, political capital from his activities in Ukraine, to the point where they idolized him, where, you know, they made road names after him, named road names after him, and making croissants in his likeness and all sorts of funky stuff. But they loved Boris Johnson in Ukraine, whereas at home he was absolutely tanking. And you could argue that he was getting so into Ukraine as a way of diverting attention domestically away from his domestic agenda and performance. But as I've said many times, you know, yeah, okay, we can understand the motivations there, but actually the end result is morally correct and practically really effective. So, you know, so be it.
Or any political leader who is hamstrung domestically at home, inevitably their eyes turn abroad. It gives them stature, it gives them presence, and it also is a lot more, how do I put this, glamorous than trying to untangle knotty political issues at home. So I do think that plays a role. But I also think, too, that he has been well briefed on the evolving military situation, perhaps better briefed than many others in Europe about what the worst case scenario could mean. And as a response to that, he is now trying to vocalise the serious conversations that need to be being had about what Europe's red lines are, as I say. Because if we don't articulate them now, then they're going to be having to be made in a hurry and in a desperate hurry, and that's when you may have mistakes being made. And not only that, if we do articulate the red lines now, as we've said many times, then maybe there can be the prevention of disasters later down the road. So I'm very willing at this moment, today, and who knows what will happen next week, to nod politely in Mr. Macron's direction. Certainly compared to, I would say, the leadership by Rishi Sunak at the moment in Britain and Olaf Scholz in Germany, he's doing a commendable job. But as ever, David, it's deeds, not words, that count.
And absolutely, and I think France really are starting to do both. There's the industrial military complex. French, huge military exporter as they are now, the second biggest in the world, are getting involved in helping Ukraine a lot more. And in fact, when you look at the amount of funding France has given to Ukraine, taking into account what they give to Ukraine via EU funding, I mean, it's as a percentage of GDP, it's above the UK, for example. So, right, as someone says here, I just gained a lot more respect for France's President Macron. So a little bit more love to Macron here, weirdly. This is the actual telephone call between Macron and Putin 4 days before the invasion of Ukraine. It's a very tense conversation and shows Putin's extreme delusions about what's happening in Ukraine. This is a fascinating bit of, I guess, television and a fascinating phone call. And actually, I've not listened to it all, but this part really spoke to me, which is Macron getting a bit shirty with Putin and talking about, being amazed that he would have the legal gumption to say what he's saying, type thing. Anyway, I'll let you read the subtitles first of all, just so you can get the sound of the voice as well.
Des régions de Donetsk et Luhansk, dans le cadre du groupe de contact tripartite. C'est exactement ce qu'on propose de faire. Donc, je ne sais pas où ton juriste a appris le droit. Moi, je regarde juste les textes et j'essaie de les appliquer. Et je ne sais pas quel juriste pourra te dire que dans un pays souverain, les textes de loi sont proposés par des groupes séparatistes et pas par les autorités démocratiquement élues.
So I'll then go back and read this, and to that, by the way, Putin says, and it says brackets, firm and annoyed tone. So if Putin is annoyed, this is not a democratically elected government. He's talking about Ukraine, of course, is full of delusions. These, but what what uh, what Macron is saying here, he's basically talked about. So what happens is Putin says, I think you should refer to the Minsk agreement, paragraphs 9, 10, and 11, and like as I told you last time. And then Macron says, I have them in front of me. It is written that, so he's come prepared. It's written that the government of Ukraine, paragraph 9, etc., is proposing. Sorry, I've got to. Well, in fact, I'll read this as it goes with the sound down. So the government of Ukraine, paragraph 9, etc., is proposing, and that it is in consultation and agreement with the representatives of certain districts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions within the framework of the tripartite contact group. This is exactly what he proposes to do. So I don't know where your lawyer learned the law. I just look at the text and try to apply them. And I don't know which lawyer will be able to tell you that in a sovereign country, the laws are proposed by separatist groups and not by the democratically elected authorities. So, and that's when, Putin then goes, well, it's not democratically elected government, but Macron is being really quite forceful with Putin. Remember, Putin is like one of the most kind of feared rulers in the world, if you like. And Macron's got no compunction with saying, mate, I don't know what lawyers you're listening to, dude, but not in any democratically elected sovereign nation does that work. Yeah, so, hats off to Macron. Let's give credit where credit is due. Anyway, that's enough Francophilia. Let's move on to Austria here, who have expelled 2 Russian diplomats. According to preliminary data, they were suspected of espionage. The Austrian Foreign Ministry said that diplomats must leave the country by next Tuesday in connection with the inconsistency with their diplomatic status. Kremlin said it would respond to Vienna's groundless decision. This is good news because Austria is one of these countries where there's a populist right wing that is chomping at the bit to take control. That they have a lot of connection with Russia. That they're a neutral nation, and they kind of hide behind that a little bit. And so it's good to see Austria here being a little bit robust with regard to Russian espionage. Now, talking about other kind of far right brewings. Dutch far-right leader Geert Wilders will not become the next Prime Minister. It's still going on this. The elections happened a long time ago, but because it's proportional representation with so many parties, so his party got the largest, minority, the biggest minority votes out of all the parties. So all parties have got minority votes. No one gets over 50%, particularly in such a fractured fractured is the wrong word. With so many political parties, it's very difficult for anyone to get over 50%. So his party got the most, but no one really wants to go into coalition with him and his party. So that is rumbling on. They're still trying to work out who's going to rule the Netherlands. Now, this is good news because he is the most kind of pro-Russian political player in Dutch politics there. So he's failed to reach an agreement with other parties. We'll have to see what coalition does emerge. Now, I talked about this yesterday. 5,000 people rallying in Slovakia to protest Prime Minister Fico's pro-Russian foreign policy, waving Ukrainian, EU and NATO flags, calling Russia a terrorist state. Quote, I don't like the direction our PM is taking after the elections. I'm disappointed. We are part of the West, a Slovakian random said. Now, Fico's come out and said that it won't change his opinion on the war in Ukraine because his Czech colleague... his opinion on the war in Ukraine won't change because his Czech colleague Fiala wants to. So, on the back of there being protests within Slovakia, the Czech Prime Minister, as I explained yesterday, came out and kind of said there is this growing division between Czechia and Slovakia. So remember, that country used to be Czechoslovakia. Now you've got the Czech Republic, or Czechia, and Slovakia. Robert Fico is talking about there being this... both politicians talking about there being a difference between the two nations now with regard to the Ukraine war. But Fico saying it's not going to change my opinion, even if, my Czech colleague Fiala wants me to change my opinion. According to Fico, his government will continue with a sovereign foreign policy, adding that Ukraine needs a ceasefire and peace talks. Nothing to do with, of course, Russia being behind pulling out and causing peace talks to emerge, because Russia have actually ceased to be so aggressive. Now, moving on, I'm not going to do much on American politics today. You'll be happy to know, but I just thought this was interesting, given Serbia's position as in the Balkans, and being pro-Russia and having a little bit of democratic backsliding, wanting to join the EU but not really. You've got ultra-nationalist tendencies within Serbia, fomented by, I think, Russian influence, and they are very much in the mould of Viktor Orban's Hungary and Robert Fico's, or at least the administration in Slovakia. So this is the building of the former army headquarters in Belgrade. It was hit during a NATO bombing in 1999. The Vučić regime, so the present president, who is looking to go down an authoritarian route, is about to give it free of charge. Wonder who's going to give it to? Oh, Jared Kushner. Kushner Realty. So the son-in-law of Donald Trump. So we've got Hungary and Orban visiting Mar-a-Lago and being given the red carpet treatment. And then we have Trump's son-in-law getting a massive building in the middle of Belgrade given to him for free. Given to him and Atlantic Incubation Partners LLC, which is an American company connected to Trump's son-in-law. Both of those are connected to Trump's son-in-law. So just, there's more on that. You can go and read. You can find information on this. I just think it's all rather dubious. Now, talking about the discharge petition that's looking more and more imperiled, both of them, you can try and make a difference. So Fred Feller here has made a thread of all the Democrats who haven't signed a discharge petition regarding Ukraine, because of course it has Israel funding on there, the helping to fund the war aims in Israel, and that's obviously very divisive. I would have issues with that as well. I believe the present administration is making aid far more conditioned than just giving them a bunch of stuff, and there's humanitarian aid within that. Nonetheless, Democrats, and this is fairly predictable, have come out, a number of them, I think 36 at the moment, and not voted for Ukraine aid based on the Israel aid there. So anyway, Fred Feller here says, I'll provide a personal message to each, their telephone numbers and email. I welcome others to message them too. Please keep it courteous. I know it's tough. Emotions are running high. And so he's got a thread. If you want to check out Fred Feller on on Twitter, you can go and find your local congressman or woman from a Democratic congressperson, that is, from whatever state you're in, whatever district you're in, who has not yet voted for that discharge petition, and see if you can make a difference. And I would urge you to do so if you are American. Right, and then you can also just generally help with putting pressure on other representatives like Republicans who need to sign the discharge bill as well, a discharge petition as well. So there are many places you can find support for this on Twitter. Just put in discharge petition into the search bar and lots comes up. Here's one from Nathan Nana Loves You, giving a telephone number that you can call to tell your representative to sign a discharge petition for Ukraine aid now. They count these calls and your call counts. And actually gives a nice little summary of all the benefits for the US that support for Ukraine begets. So a nice, useful little tweet there. Anyway, moving on. That's me done on American politics. Hey, no more bashing Trump. So that's good. The quote, the problem will be solved within a few weeks. The chairman of the committee of the Polish Sejm on blocking the border. So that's looking like being solved soon. Apparently, the farmers' protest concern a fundamental problem has no direct relation to Ukraine. In the history of the EU, there have already been hundreds of similar crises, and they were resolved, he said. And that's perfectly true. It's just one of these things where Russian entities will amplify already existing issues. I was just listening when I went to my appointment this morning to Jessica Arrow's book Russia's Trolls, talking about Russia Today and how they reported before they were kind of banned and whatnot. RT reported as a kind of muscled in as a major media organization, but really just doing Russian propaganda. And even though they got American and British and other sort of Western journalists, it was a really interesting portion of the book where she talks about how they sort of censored things or amplified certain things and reported other aspects in certain ways. Really interesting. But yeah, they would take American divisive issues and amplify them. So it's not like they don't have to invent the issues, but they amplify them in such a way that they become much more serious than they otherwise would have been, or talked about much more loudly and much more further. So they talk about it endlessly, boost it so it goes further, and then amplify it so it's louder. All these things that RT do, I thought that was really interesting. So things like Occupy Democrats, when that was happening, any kind of issue that involves the US having domestic political problems, RT would be there like blowing that out of proportion to some degree. And that is the amplification that is a challenge. Right, Denmark will overhaul its armed forces due to the threat from Russia. Denmark plans to conscript women for military service, extending the serving period for both men and women from 4 to 11 months, so on and so forth. Lots in there, but basically this is something that many nations within Europe appear to be doing, including the Germans. You've got Nordic nations, the Germans, and Baltic nations. Some of them already have conscription, others have got rid of conscription, are bringing it back possibly, and others changing their rules to make people serve for longer and have more people, such as including women as well. So this is all in response to what Putin has done. And again, Putin has kind of shot himself in the foot. Instead of dealing with what he sees as encroaching NATO and putting pay to that, he's actually strengthened NATO, given them 2 more members, given them much greater border with Russia, and also forcing the hand of all of these European nations to militarily upscale. And yeah, it's just, as I say, shot himself in the foot. Right, so going back to RT here, RT reporting on Putin, saying, your vampire ball is over, Putin to Western elites. Exploitation of other nations by the so-called golden billion is coming to an end, the Russian president has stated. Well done, Putin, for saying that. Well done for having a go at those elites. God, I hate those elites. Says the man who owns 20 houses, 700 cars, 58 aircraft and helicopters, and a $716 million plane. A huge, big super yacht. In fact, he has 11 super yachts. Not just he has one big, huge one, but he's got 11 super yachts. And reports also claim that the bunker midget's personal... I shouldn't laugh at that. The bunker man's personal wealth stood at a staggering $200 billion. So he's supposed to be the richest man in the world, but he's just hidden his finances so well that no one knows quite what he owns. He's also the head of a gangster state where he has introduced new strict laws on freedom of speech and jailed or killed all of his opposition. But, Western elites, yeah? Because he's not the ultimate elite in the entire world. He is literally the most elite person, given the context of his country, that you can imagine. So, screw you, Putin. Right, and speaking of Putin, speaking of Russia, Russia's weapons exports have dropped dramatically under the shadow of Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and global sanctions that followed. According to SIPRI, while it exported arms to 31 countries in 2019, that number has plummeted to 12 this year. The scale of Russia's weapons to other countries, fell by 53% between the 5-year periods of 2014 to 18 and 2019 to 2023, according to the latest report by the think tank dated on March 11th. The report noted the 3 largest receivers of Russian-made weapons between 2019 and 2023 were, so this is still ongoing, but also a little bit before the war, India, China, and Egypt. However, the amount of equipment those guys acquired underwent steep decreases. So between 2014 and 18 and 2019 and 2023, Russia's exports to India have fallen by 34%, to China 39%, Egypt by 54%. And that is because, particularly for India and China, they are getting to a kind of critical mass stage in terms of, population, and therefore the industry that can sustain, and the investment in in those industries and technology, that they are starting to make things themselves. So it's both a kind of repudiation of Russian equipment, but also the idea that they can sustain their own manufacturing industries and jobs and get tax revenue in, but also have that national security is heightened if you're making your own stuff and you're not dependent on others, particularly in the defense sector. And so, yes, they can look at the Russian stuff and say, well, it's not as good as you might think it is. So we're not going to buy that. We're going to get it from the US, but also we're going to make our own. And that's more often for lower end stuff. So it might be sort of weapons, small arms, ammunition, and some of the cheaper sort of vehicles and whatnot. Anyway, additionally, Algeria and Vietnam, who were Russia's third and fourth largest recipients in 2014 to 18, saw their exports drop by 83 and 91% respectively. The newest figure, combined with overall low number of pending Russian arms deliveries, suggests that the country's exports in the defence sector are likely to remain low, with a draw of made in Russia military equipment is waning, according to the analysis. One trend relates to the continents of Asia and Oceania, the regions which accounted for 68% of overall Russian weapons exports in 2018 to 2023 are now seeing the rise of the US as their largest arms supplier. So the war in Ukraine, I think, has had knock-on effects to the arms industry in the US, where people are seeing some of their equipment like HIMARS looking really good and saying, right, we're going to buy those guided multiple launch rocket systems from the US as opposed to any from Russia. Several Asian countries have hinted in the last year at their intention to decrease their arms dependency on Russia, rather looking to diversify their supply chains or build up their domestic industries. And of course, Russia is building stuff for themselves. They can't afford, literally, not in monetary terms, but in war terms, they can't afford to export stuff to other countries when they desperately need it themselves on the front line. Another important shift in arms transfers between the two periods analysed was the move of France ahead of Russia in the ranking of arms exporting nations. Paris is now the world's second largest weapons exporter, recording a 47% increase in sales. With European nations scrambling for weapons to fill their own stocks or to support Ukraine, continent logged a significant increase in arms imports, which were 94% higher in the past 5-year window than in 2014 to 18. Purchases from the US accounted for 55% of the uptick. Weapons high on countries' lists were currently are both combat aircraft and helicopters. So that's the sort of things that you're not going to be able to easily make yourself. You really got to go abroad, unless you are the country that has that capability. To develop that is a huge undertaking. So nations will go to either Russia or the US or France for those, maybe Eurofighter. South Korea might have a little bit to say. China does make its own jets now. So anyway, weapons high on the country's list are combat aircraft and helicopters, with 800 on order globally, as well as air defense systems and greater interest in long-range missiles. Okay, I said I wouldn't talk about Trump, but I'm going to let someone else talk about that, but I'm not going to play it. Just this is one of Jon Stewart's greatest monologues, by the way. It came out just after, much after, a couple of days ago, after the State of the Union, but it's a really on-point thing about the Constitution. It says a lot about whether the present sort of GOP under Trump is constitutional or not, and the idea that they claim to be real Americans and real patriots, and actually everything they're doing and saying is not constitutional and therefore essentially not patriotic. It's really interesting. It is comedy, but the genius of things like John Oliver and Jon Stewart is that you learn so much, particularly John Oliver's last week tonight. You learn so much about obscure topics when you watch them, and then have some belly laughs as well. And just a random aside here, because I've got solar panels on my house, and I've just got myself the cheapest electric car I could get. It's a nice electric car, it's good, but to replace an old beaten up car. and I'm trying to make the right moves, what I think ethically, but also I'm really into renewables. Like I've always been geekily like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we could sustain our own, like, you know, if things were sustainable, not from environmental reasons particularly, although that is really cool, but just I love the idea of being self-sustaining and, you know, not just drawing from finite resources. I just love that. Anyway, Uruguay's former national director of energy, in response to the fact that Uruguay has run on 100% renewables for 8 straight months in a row, said we broke 2 false paradigms. One, it's possible to manage a nearly 100% renewable electricity system with a high share of wind and solar energy. And 2, yes, renewable energies are the cheapest option today. Now, when you talk about negative externalities and subsidization of those through tax, actually things like fossil fuel industries and even nuclear industry, heavily subsidized, end up being far more expensive, but people just look at like the straight up costs, right? But actually the costs are also how much is subsidized by taxpayers through things like paying for you know, clearing up coal slag piles and stuff like that. Anyway, it is becoming cheaper and cheaper. And so why this is important, actually, it's not just random. This is important for getting us, as being part of the mix at least, for getting us off dependency on hydrocarbons. In other words, dependency on Russia. It's really important that nations start diversifying their energy portfolios and start throwing into the mix more and more energy independency, so that we aren't paying places like Russia crazy amounts of money, but actually US is now drilling and exporting more oil and gas than it's ever done previously. So there you go. Anyway, please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate your support. It's been another long one. Take care. Speak soon.